Have you ever thought about what happens when you're gone? How are you going to be remembered in this life? What are you leaving behind? There comes a point, I think, in all of our lives where we begin to consider what life will be like after I am no longer here, after I leave this world. And as I get older, the more comes to my mind as to what I will leave behind. If any of you are fans of The West Wing, it's a show that followed a man named Jed Bartlett. He was soon to become the President of the United States. And after the first 100 days, after the midterms, after his re-election, after 4 seasons, you finally get to him as he starts his second term, right? In the 5th season. You got to really hang in there to get to the storyline. But there's no third term for the President of the United States. And so his staff begins to ask him questions. They begin to press him for what will happen after the second term. They begin to ask him what will be his legacy. I think we're all faced with the same question. What will be the legacy we leave on this world? It's what's prompted this series throughout the next few weeks. We will all leave some sort of legacy. The church will leave a legacy. But what will that be? The goal here in this series is to look at how we can live a life that outlives ourselves. We're going to begin to look at that life and what that means to be in a life that outlives what we are currently doing. We're going to begin to look at how we can be a church that leaves a lasting legacy on the community. Now, when I was growing up, I was taught to leave a space or a room better than when I found it, or cleaner than when I found it. I don't know where that comes from. You can ask my mom later. But it's in there. It's deep inside of me, and it just has stuck to the point it has become the mantra when my brother and I were running our youth camp. Okay, it's a week-long camp with teenagers. Have you ever seen a teenager after a week? You need to have that kind of mantra. And so that became our mantra, to leave the spaces that we use throughout the week in a better condition than when we found them. And if I might suggest this morning, as we consider our own legacy, a church's legacy, shouldn't we strive for the same within our lives? To leave this world, to leave the church in a better way than when we found it? So over the next few weeks, we're going to follow this thought on legacy. To live a life that outlives you. We're going to do that through the eyes of Nehemiah. Let me tell you something about Nehemiah. I love the story of Nehemiah. It is something that pumps me up inside. It's like a rally cry for what we call in America to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. I love the story of Nehemiah because he saw something. He saw a need. He saw the state of his homeland, and his heart broke for it. The time of Nehemiah happened during Israel's exile during the Persian Empire. He was entrusted to be the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And one day, one of his brothers comes to him and says, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. The province of Judah was in shambles and disgrace. The people of Israel, God's people, no longer had a place considered sacred for themselves. And Nehemiah's heart broke for it. He mourned for it. He hurt for what was going on. He prayed for it for days. Some commentators would go as far to say he did this for 4 months straight, fasting and praying and weeping over Jerusalem. When he was finished, Nehemiah, he then knew what he needed to do, to leave a legacy for his people. So he prays further to God. I encourage you to read that full prayer within Nehemiah 1. We don't have the time to get into every single detail within that prayer, but it is rich with an understanding of who God is to this people, and our place within that puzzle. Within Nehemiah's context, he prayed to God knowing that he was all-powerful, knowing that he was a God who kept his covenants. In this prayer, he refers to the covenant of Abraham, that Israel would be a great nation. He refers to the covenant of Moses, that if they followed God's ways, they would prosper in the land. Then he goes on to recognize that the people of Israel had not followed God's ways, and now they were in ruin. Jerusalem was in ruin. See, but that wasn't Nehemiah's concern. It was more than that. He's concerned about God's people exalting God and serving God. It was about their fulfilling their purpose of being a kingdom of priests. Nehemiah ends his prayer this way. Remember the instruction you gave to your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, and even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Nehemiah wants to see restoration come to Jerusalem, to see restoration of the people of God as servants of God, for it and them to become what they once were, the place where Yahweh chose for his name to dwell. Commentator T.J. Betts writes it this way: Nehemiah understands God's people were chosen to be God's servants, and it is with this humble spirit and sense of purpose he prays. He identifies with the people of God and knows that he is not alone in his desire and prayers for the restoration of Jerusalem. Moreover, Nehemiah trusts in the power of God and the wisdom of God's timing in answering his prayer. And just as a side note to this whole story, the sovereignty of God in the midst of this story cannot be missed. None of this should have worked out. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to a king, an exiled cupbearer to a king who ruled in Persia and an empire. The pieces should not have fit together for an exiled cupbearer to come to a king and ask to restore the kingdom that once was Jerusalem. But God's hand is in the midst of all of what is going on here. And God opened the door. And Nehemiah set off to build the legacy for his people. Nehemiah continues his story. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. Within this first section of chapter 2, Nehemiah tells of his first steps in building a life that outlived himself, to take on a project that seems insurmountable. Have you ever felt that before? Taking on a project that seems just undoable? Something that's been on your heart, you have no idea how you're going to finish it. Maybe it's some big project at work, some policy that you're creating that goes beyond your time. Maybe it could be breaking an addiction that you don't know how to get past, but it could change the course and reset your life. Or figuring out how to raise your kids in this world as they grow up so that they become better than you were. Or to be a church trying to find traction in a slippery world. I faced a similar struggle when I took over the care of the buildings at Malaga Camp. Many of you know that I have a passion for building. I have a desire to improve structures in that way. God made me who I was for that purpose, to try and make the world a better place. And I saw that in the buildings of the camp. The problem was you have nowhere to start. I thought I could begin there to see restoration in the buildings, and it would flow through the rest of the camp life. The new energy would come into the grounds if I could just rebuild a building at a time. The problem was there were 28 of them, all of them in disrepair, all of them needing major construction work to even get back to normal. No idea where to start. No idea even where to begin except with this purpose in my heart and an eye on the future. Now, to take a lesson from Nehemiah, his first step in the preparation to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem was to personally and privately go through and inspect every structure along the entire wall without anybody even knowing about it. He needed to know what needed to be done. And with any task, any legacy, you need to know the end goal. You need to know what needs to be done so that you have a direction. We need to know the goal. This doesn't have to be a public display. In fact, Nehemiah set out at night to inspect every piece of the wall with no one being the wiser. He went to see every little piece without anybody knowing what he was doing. It was the last piece of peace that he had in this project, to sit and think about and contemplate what was needed to be done. Nehemiah recognized that there was a time for silent, prayerful, and thoughtful contemplation, and there was a time to speak. Nehemiah could discern between the two because he knew that he needed to know where he needed to go before he spoke to the people. The same holds true for us. Before I could begin rebuilding the camp, rebuilding the buildings, I needed to know what I was up against. I needed time to think. I needed time to dream about what I wanted it to look like for the people and for what comes after me. And whenever I get into that mindset, whenever I start to think in those regards, I turn to one of the biggest dreamers of this age, Walt Disney. And in the 1940s and the 1950s, he had a dream for a place to bring families together. An insurmountable dream that people thought he was crazy to do. But as he walked through the orange groves of California, he knew what he needed to do. He could see the end result in his mind. And this picture right here is one of my favorite pictures. What you see is Walt Disney standing in an open field, and a grayed out image behind him. That grayed out image what would become Walt Disney World in Florida. 15 years after the success of Disneyland, the dream that he had set in his mind, because he knew what he wanted to see. Now, he would never step foot in Disney World, but he called it his Florida project. And those who came after him set out to finish the work that he begun and the legacy that he began to create inside of his life. He knew the goal. He knew what he wanted to see. And it would outlive him. We need to do the same. If we're going to build a legacy within our lives, and we're going to build a legacy inside of the church, we need to begin to think about what it will be like when we are no longer here. When we are no longer in leadership, we need to know the goal. Nehemiah took the time he needed to think about the future, to think about what he needed to do to move forward. And when it was time, he rallied the people. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They said, let's start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Nehemiah pulls the people of Jerusalem together. Now they were the remnant of who was left over after the exile. They had lived in this situation for a long time, with everything in ruin around them. And so Nehemiah comes before them, and he had to be honest about the situation. Even though there was difficulty ahead, the task was hard in front of them, Nehemiah doesn't sugarcoat this for the people. It's not, you need to do this, but it became, we need to do this. He tells them the truth of the situation, even though it was hard. He wants everyone to face the reality. And there's another reality. Nehemiah needed them to understand the dire situation that they were in because they became comfortable with it. Like I said, they had been there for a long time. They had sat inside the ruins for a long time. And it just became normal. The ruins became normal for them. It's human nature to get used to the poor conditions, that we barely notice them after a while. We learn to live with them, and what may once have been glaringly unacceptable can become completely ignored. We get so comfortable in where we are that we don't see the ruins around us. We accept a bad situation because that's just how it is. We continue doing the same thing over and over and over again because this is how it's done. It's not until our eyes are open to the situation that we realize how bad they've actually gotten. The first step to making any lasting change, to building any legacy, and to live a life that outlives ourselves and within the church is to honestly assess the situation around us. To honestly evaluate what we do and how we do it. Until we can have that honest assessment, until we can have that evaluation, we cannot and we will not recognize the need for change. Trust me, that can be hard. Within the narrative of the buildings of the camp, me and my team, we assessed all the needs and the problems across all 28 buildings. And when you list them out to the board and you put a price tag in it that is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, awareness comes. You didn't realize how bad things have gotten, and the issue becomes real. We realized that we could not continue to keep going the way that we were going with the situation the buildings were in because they would fall down on their own. We wouldn't have to do anything. So my team, we got together and we looked, we inspected, we evaluated. We had to have an honest look at each space, away from my own personal feelings, away from how the memories I had from when I was a kid staying in those buildings. You have to honestly look at what's going on to know what can happen. And to see the situation the way that it was eye-opening. It was a catalyst for change. The unfortunate reality within any change situation, once you know the goal, once you know and you honestly evaluate and assess the problem, and you begin that good work to build lasting change, to build something beyond yourself, it's going to make somebody upset. Opposition will come in the midst of any change. Nehemiah continues telling the story after they began their work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Try and change anything at all, especially something that has been the same for a very long time. I dare you. I do. Because I guarantee you, once you begin that good work, once you begin to move forward, the critics are going to come. They're going to come out of the woodwork where they hadn't been for 20 or 30 years because you moved my pencil. It happens. Have you ever heard any of the following? You just don't understand the history of it. This is how we do it, and you don't respect that. You're too young, and you don't get it. It was better the way it was. You're doing things differently, and I don't like it. I miss the way you used to be. Any of those ring a bell throughout your life? Opposition comes at all sides. The truth, though, and what gave Nehemiah this unwavering conviction is that God put this on his heart, and nothing was going to stop him from moving forward with what God put on his heart. He understood that whenever the people of God do the work of God, it will always stir up the enemies of God. Opposition comes when you become a change agent in your own life. Opposition will come when you become the change agent of your life. When you start thinking about legacy and the generations that come after you and the kingdom of God and how that's going to affect them. They will try to put you down. They'll try to scare you. They'll even go as far to try and misrepresent who you are to bring you down. Sometimes this even happens within the church itself. It doesn't just happen out there. It happens in here also. The task before us is great. But more often than not, the Lord calls his people to do great deeds that are impossible apart from him. He calls us to greatness because it's impossible and only he can do it. Nehemiah set off on an incredible task because God set something alive in his heart. God set something in his heart, and he pursued it with unwavering conviction. He knew the goal before him. He knew the situation with a brutal honesty. And he was prepared for whatever opposition was going to come. As we continue throughout this series and Nehemiah's journey, we will see how he managed such a great task in such a short amount of time because God said something alive in who he was. To build a legacy for the people of God that went far beyond Nehemiah, that stretches all the way to where we stand today. The reality was, nothing was going to keep him from doing what God put on his heart. Nothing was going to stop Nehemiah from pressing on. Nehemiah had a resolve to obey God, to seek his glory, regardless of the cost, regardless of the difficulty that he was going to face. Can we be that in our own lives? Can we be that within our own lives today? Can we be that in the church? Can we be a people that wants to live our lives and do church in a way that outlives us standing here today? To set the future up for success for the generations that come, to leave it better than when we found it. Being a faithful follower of Christ is a call to have a stiff backbone in the face of opposition. The church needs to be full of believers with the same kind of endless determination that set Nehemiah on a journey. Can we have that? Can we have that this morning as we begin to talk about legacy, to begin to build a legacy in our lives and in the church today? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, the story of Nehemiah has come to us this morning. Something you have set alive inside of his life. And Lord, it is my prayer that you set alive a task that is insurmountable within our own and within this church. That you would set something on the heart of our beings, the heart of this church, something that only you can do. And that we would catch that and we would run with it with unwavering determination. God, as we turn to a time of communion, a time of sharing in a legacy, that we remember why we do it, why it matters, and that you would set something alive inside of us and who we are. We give you the rest of our time. It's in your name. Amen.